Now, when it comes to cultural tensions, and there's certainly been plenty of those of late, do you think politicians help resolve issues or seek to inflame them? New research suggests that many people think they do more for the latter and would rather their leaders took something of a balanced approach. I'm joined by one of those behind this study, Morin Commons' Luke Tryl. Luke, great to see you this morning. Just take us through exactly what the research has found, because some of it, I suspect, many people will be nodding their heads along with.
Yeah, so obviously we hear a lot these days about the so-called culture wars, which are apparently sort of dividing the country in two. So what we decided to do was to go out and speak to Britons in focus groups right across the country to get their views on some of these flashpoints. And what we found was really interesting. So firstly, rather than the country sort of splitting into these binary divides between sort of statue saviours and people who want to tear them down, people are really much more nuanced. They understand why colonial era statues might be out of place in a town square, but they're interested in the process about how we decide what to do with them. The second thing that we found was that they really think that both politicians and campaigners are turning what should be discussions about these sensitive issues, whether it is statues or trans rights or any of the other flashpoints that we've heard about, into rows. We've coined this phrase culture war arsonists. It's people who are deliberately seeking to inflame the public debate for their own end rather than meeting the public where they are. And then the final thing we found was that there's actually this very British way that people want to go about and see cultural change in the UK, and that's about having the space to ask silly questions, to make mistakes, to not have people too readily take offence when they do make mistakes. And the space for that is clearly narrowing. People right across the country told us they were scared to express an opinion increasingly now for fear of saying the wrong thing. So in this report, what we're doing is we're calling on both politicians but also campaigners to actually listen to the public, to try and meet the public halfway and create the space where we can discuss changes. Because, Britain has a proud history of cultural change. And when we spoke to people in our focus groups, they talk with pride about advances we've made on gender equality, advances we've made on gay equality. And there's no reason that the rows today couldn't go the same way, but it needs those culture war arsonists, those politicians, those campaigners, dare I say it, the trolls on Twitter, to just tone down the debate and actually meet the public where they want to be met on these issues.
Look, I want to return to the idea of the British way of doing things in just a second. But isn't this research, and I'm being slightly facetious here, but isn't this research just a complicated way of saying, social media isn't real life?
I think that's definitely part of it. There's a really interesting research which shows that I think it's 80% of tweets come from 2% of the population. So it's really not real life. But I think what we're starting to see, what we found in these conversations, is those discussions on social media are starting to bleed into everyday lives. So people talked about workplaces and schools starting also to become areas of conflict as well, because that discourse from politicians and campaigners is now seeping into there as well, leaving people scared and afraid of making mistakes.
In terms, though, of this British way of doing things, getting together, having a discussion, nudging progress, maybe doing it over a cup of tea, I have to say, I think of occasions like, the poll tax riots, the suffragettes jumping in front of horses, Stonewall, essentially outing politicians. I get the idea that sometimes we like to discuss these matters and move things forward incrementally, but some fairly seismic changes have happened in the United Kingdom in a way that runs entirely counter to your definition of a British way of doing things.
And that's not to say that there is no room for these kind of more high-profile protests and marches, which, can really draw attention to a cause. But actually, if you look at lots of successful change, and actually, same-sex marriage is a good example. If you look at how campaigners pitch same-sex marriage as building on the institution of marriage, not tearing it down or trying to destroy it, but bringing more people into it, strengthening something British. The fact that it was a Conservative Prime Minister who ended up bringing it in because campaigners worked so hard, not just with people who naturally shared their views, but people across the political spectrum. So absolutely, there is a role for protest, there is a role for drawing attention, making some noise, But to build lasting change, you need to build those big tents. And the British people are naturally conservative. One of the best quotes we got from one of the groups was, when it comes to British people, we get sent a steak we don't like, but, we just sit there and eat it anyway. We don't make a racket and make a fuss. I actually think that lots of our approach to social change we see in the same way. We're happy to see protests and things, but if we're going to be truly brought in, we need people to meet us where we are. We need them to speak in normal, everyday language, not some of the campaigning jargon that you sometimes hear, and also to relate it to people's real experiences.
Sure.
Again, we heard how things like soaps, for instance, were really powerful at introducing people to new concepts and ideas in a way that actually a politician's speech or a campaigner is never going to do, because try as we might, we're not going to reach everyone through them. But something like TV shows, soaps, they beam these social issues into people's living room, allowing people to grapple with them and come to terms with them in their own time, in their own space.
Look, we've got 20 seconds left on the interview. We've talked about politicians stoking the fires, fanning the flames of the culture war. Name names then. Go on. What's the Prime Minister's involvement?
That's not the purpose of the report. I think, the interesting thing is that the blame goes right across the ideological spectrum. This isn't a Tory, Labour, progressive, reactionary thing, but it's the extremes, the cultural arsonists on both sides of the debate. And we hope that they will read this report, take notice, and start living up to the public's expectations for navigating change.
You sidestepped that bear trap incredibly well. Luke Tryl, good to see you this morning. Thanks for being with us.